Hi everyone, I am Carrie. So excited about the course coming up. And I wanted to give you a little pre course work or lecture, I guess, on some of the key themes that we will be diving into in the course. Most of them deal with the approaches that performance coaches take to programming. And this is mostly for healthy athletes and mostly for speed power athletes. So during the course, we'll break this down and talk more about how we apply these concepts in a rehab setting and also how we can apply these concepts with more endurance oriented athletes. And so this is a very broad strokes talk, just to familiarize yourselves with some language and some concepts and just kind of get us all on the same page. So here we go. So just a brief overview about me and my career. I've been coaching for about 25 years now. I started my athletic career. I played basketball in high school, but I was also an endurance athlete, cross country and distance runner, and went on to college to be a distance runner and then started coaching as a collegiate distance coach. And through a weird course of events, I kind of had to take over coaching the throws program at the college that I was at. And so I kind of embraced that technical side of coaching and the speed power athlete world and pretty much built a career, a college coaching career, as a throws coach in the NCAA Division I system. I had a brief 3-year stint in the middle of all that where I left college coaching and started working privately in Denver, in Lone Tree actually. And there I trained a lot of scholastic athletes, high school swimmers, volleyball players, some combine guys. I worked with a post-collegiate distance running group in Colorado Springs. I was a strength coach for a volleyball team, et cetera, et cetera. Then I got back into the coaching world, a college coaching world at University of Wyoming as a throws coach. And then I landed where I am today about 2.5 years ago. And that is working again with distance runners, but now in a professional setting, where I program and coach their strength work and their speed work. And that is with the Under Armour Pro Running Group. And so that's where I am today. That's kind of just the general broad strokes of my experience and my path. And so through the course of the weekend, you'll hear me give a lot of track and field examples. It's kind of where I live and breathe, but I definitely have had experience implementing a lot of this programming with court sport athletes, field sport athletes, pro runners, high school runners, et cetera, et cetera. So pretty broad base of experience. Okay, so why would rehab specialists want to learn about training healthy athletes? They generally work with the ones that are injured. Well, through the duration of this course, our theme with that Jay and I both have is that when we can program rehab that is more similar looking and feeling to training, as the athlete gets healthier and healthier and our rehab processes work, the athlete will return to sport more durable and more ready to perform their sport. I heard a coach recently give this analogy that rehab is training, but it's just very low level training. And so you'll see these two pictures here. This is the first picture with the guy jumping over the hurdles with the mountains in the background. That is a multi-time Olympic trials marathon qualifier. So high-level athlete, Division I athlete, high-level pro runner, doing hurdle hops. The picture on the other side of the frame is a little, 6-year-old girl jumping over those same exact hurdles. And so this coach talked about how when you train an athlete who's injured, let's say a high-level athlete, you just treat that athlete like they're a lower-level athlete temporarily. So let's say our marathoner gets injured and we still want him to do some sort of bouncy work, which we'll explain in depth later why we'd want an athlete like that to do that kind of work. Well, we water down the task, we remediate the task, but keep the neural integration and the neuromotor patterning there, present in some form. And so that's why I think rehab specialists learning kind of the nuts and bolts and the approaches of performance training can help the rehab process as well. We can mirror sort of that spectrum that a healthy athlete would train along. Okay, so again, I come from a track and field world. I teach I teach a training course to other track and field coaches. And so this is a lot of language that is used in the track coaches education world. It's also used a lot in the strength training world, but it may be something that, again, rehab specialists maybe aren't familiar with. So just want to make sure we're kind of on the same page when it comes to just terminology. So when coaches look at planning a season, we call that an annual plan. And really simply, that is, let's say it's 1 year. Within that year, an athlete may have multiple events that they're peaking for. So if you think of like a high school distance runner, for example, they generally have 3 seasons: indoor or cross country, indoor track, or maybe they even do another sport indoors. Hopefully they do, to get a little bit of variety of movement. And then outdoor track. So they've got a cross country state championship. They've got maybe a basketball state championship or districts or whatever. And then they have an outdoor state championship. Maybe they go on to compete in some of the summer national meets. So each one of those seasons, we give the term of a macro cycle. So a macro cycle is one training cycle with a peak. And this would maybe apply to even like your recreational road runners, where they have kind of 2 big races that they're going to key on for the year. Within that macro cycle, we break that cycle up into training phases. 3 of the most common training phases in the track and field world and in a lot of training are the general prep phase, the specific prep phase, and the competition phase. Now, within those phases, you have what are called mesocycles. Generally, most generically, a mesocycle is equal to 1 month of training or 4 weeks of training. So in our general prep phase, we might have an 8-week general prep phase, and we would divide that up into 2 mesocycles, 2 4-week blocks. Again, generically, the next sort of training or phase, I guess, would be the microcycle. So a microcycle generally is 1 week of training, 7 days of training. You stack 4 of those microcycles together, and again, you've got your mesocycle. And that's generally good practice. Most coaches will, especially in a scholastic setting or setting where there's games every weekend, you will have a 4-week mesocycle with kind of building up for 3 weeks, and then the 4th week is a down week. Within the microcycle, within the week, you will have your sessions. So this, generally speaking, is a day of training. So 7 sessions in 1 week. 7 sessions in 1 microcycle, 7 days in 1 week. And then within the session, you'll have your different units of training. So your session, your athlete comes to practice for the day. Your unit 1, warm up. Unit 2, a little bit of plyometric work. Unit 3, sprint work, let's say. Unit 4, weight training. So those are some units within one session. So kind of bookmark this slide, keep it handy just in case you're not familiar with these terms. They're pretty self-explanatory, but but they're good to kind of reference as I get rolling. Now, I will say that not all mesocycles are 1 month long. Not all microcycles are 1 week long. You might have a mesocycle that is 6 weeks, a month and a half. You might have microcycles that are 10 days in a cycle. I train professional long distance runners, and they're on a 10-day microcycle. But just for ease and more generic approach to training, these are, just kind of good guidelines to follow. All right, and then just a little more visual of this language. This is a sample annual plan, and this comes from the U.S. Track and Field Coaches Academy, for which I teach. So this is just an Excel sheet, or part of an Excel sheet, that we use when our students plan their training. And so if you look at just the columns on the left-hand side, you'll see the macro cycle column, and this is an annual plan for a track and field athlete. So potentially it looks like a college sprinter, let's say, starting in October. Their indoor macro cycle goes through March, and then they've got a smaller outdoor macro cycle, which essentially goes from March until the NCAA championships in June. So there's your macro cycle. The next row down is the phases that I referred to: your general prep phase, specific prep phase. Pre-comp phase just refers to like kind of early season meets or competitions. And then your comp phase is in red, the most important phases. And then that repeats in the outdoor season. The next row down is your mesocycles. Again, those are 4-week cycles. They don't have to be 4 weeks, but generally that's good practice. And then your microcycles, all those blue boxes, those are the weeks that fit into the mesocycles. And so that's kind of how it's broken up, just a good visual of that. And then breaking it down even farther, this is a sample microcycle of training. So this is a sample week of training. I know it's hard to read. It doesn't really matter really what it says. I just want to give you the visual. In the second row is session 1. That's Monday. The third row is session 2, Tuesday. There's Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday. And so again, I know it's hard to read, but it's just simply, this is a good template that a lot of track and field coaches use when planning out training. And you'll see the cells within each column are just simply the units of training. So I know you can't read it really well, but on Monday there's a warm-up unit, and then there's a static stretching unit. Oh, sorry, the first unit is a warm-up jog. The second unit is static stretching. We got into really big detail on the units. The third unit is dynamic stretching. The fourth unit is sprint drills. Fifth unit is acceleration work. Then we go into our plyometric work, and then our weight training units, and then a cool down. So those are all very detailed units of a session. Okay. Now that we have the language out of the way, I do want to tackle a few themes that will come up again and again during our course. So the first theme is the early and often integration of speed and power throughout the macro cycle. So I'll spend about 30 seconds talking about the old school approach to training, which is kind of a slow to fast approach, a high volume to low volume approach, or progression I'm talking about throughout a macro cycle, from the beginning of the cycle to the end of the cycle. That's sort of the old school approach. We start out slow and then we build speed in later. We start out with high volumes and then we taper down to low volumes. What we now know is that bouncy work, that's a term I'll use a lot, but that essentially refers to movement with some form of velocity, some form of eccentric component, and a ballistic component. So velocity, eccentric, ballistic. That's an overarching term that I will use the word bouncy for. That kind of movement elicits the proper neuromotor sequencing that promotes the most efficient movement patterns. And so, why would we, if we're back in the old school world, why would we spend a lot of time training slowly with a lack of bouncy work, a lack of eccentric work, a lack of work with velocity until the end of the year? Why would we not train the most coordinated patterns at the beginning of the year and continue to refine those patterns and build on those patterns, build endurance on those patterns throughout the season? And so the approach of really good performance coaches is to integrate the bouncy stuff, the speedy stuff, the powerful stuff early in your phases of training, in your general prep phase, and progress those types of movements along throughout the season. And so if you look down at the bottom of the slide, you've got your three phases: your general prep phase, your specific prep phase, and your comp phases. And this is sort of how you would add that stuff early in a season, because you obviously don't want to start, okay, yeah, we want to go fast. We're not gonna start day one coming off a summer vacation or coming off an off season by sprinting 100-meter sprints, because they're gonna be crappy. And so that's not where we start. And we don't start by doing a bunch of depth jumps that are big, powerful jumps or loaded jumps or anything like that. Those are great, but we've got to train up to all of those tasks. But yet, if we want to integrate those kinds of movements early on, we need to water them down and make them digestible for day one athletes, for day one practice. So how do we do that? How do we water the training down, but still keep the intensity high and the intent high from day one when we're looking at programming speed and power training? Well, if you look on this slide, you'll see an old picture from a movie from the mid-'80s called The Great Outdoors with John Candy. And in that movie, he frequents a steakhouse that has a menu item called the Old 96er. And that is a 96-ounce steak that if you eat it in a certain amount of time, you get it for free. And I forget what the time limit is. But, you're familiar with the concept. Some other steakhouses, maybe you've seen this, where you have a big old steak, and if you eat it in a certain amount of time, you get your picture on the wall and all that stuff. Well, I like the analogy of eating this big old steak as it applies to integrating speed and power training early and then progressing it throughout a season. So you're presented with this big old steak, but it looks kind of overwhelming to eat it all at once. But if you cut it up into small little bites and eat it one by one, it's very digestible. You get used to the taste. It's still a steak. And maybe a little bit later in your eating process, you can cut those pieces a little bit bigger and finish the steak in an appropriate amount of time, and you get your name on the wall and all that stuff. So it's the idea of cutting up training into small digestible pieces, but it's still a steak. It's still intense. It's still blasting like 10-meter sprints on day one, but in very approachable and easy to manage distances and power output durations. So as we progress from general prep phase into specific prep into comp phase, those bouts of power output will get longer and longer. What this does, by introducing small little bites or small little power output bouts on day one, you're training the nervous system how to coordinate, how to link muscle firing patterns, how to recruit motor units in the right order and the proper sequencing. And you're doing that from day one. But you're doing it in small little bouts so that injuries don't happen. Nobody pulls a hamstring in the first 10 meters of a race, because you're not putting the hamstring in compromised positions in those first 10 meters. Nobody pulls a hamstring doing a standing long jump, one single standing long jump. That doesn't happen. So that's the kind of work that you do early in a cycle. Small digestible work where you're still training the movement pattern, but you're cutting that movement pattern up, or you're cutting the bout of training into small little pieces that you can digest over time. As you get more experienced, now you can start adding steps, adding distances, adding volume to that training, but the intensity can stay the same because the brain catches up. The motor neuron patterns start to get ingrained. The firing sequence starts to become habit. The body essentially becomes more coordinated. And so you progress to these longer bouts of training as the season progresses. So you start with the short, intense bouts, and you finish with long, intense bouts. Here's another example, a visual of how this might work. So in the second week of training, let's say, you get all the warm up and all the terminology out of the way and all that stuff. Second week of training, we're ready to hit it. Here we go. We're going to do 15 by 10 meter sprints, and we're blasting all of them. We're giving athletes plenty of rest in between, a minute, 90 seconds rest in between. We're giving athletes proper instructions on posture. We're making sure they're getting to big ranges of motion. We're making sure their foot placement is well underneath their center of mass. All the great things that we want to teach when we're teaching athletes how to blast out of the blocks or off the line or whatever that might look like. So the athlete gets better and better at that. As we progress, let's go to the 6th week of training. 3 by 50 meters is what we might progress to. So now we're taking athletes into faster movement patterns, more upright movement patterns, more coordinatively demanding movement patterns, but they're ready to handle it because they've been slow cooking at those 10-meter distances for a long time. I didn't put this in here, but week 3, let's say, you might sprinkle in some 20-meter runs. Week 4, you sprinkle in some 30-meter runs. So by week 6, you are comfortably at 50 meters. But we don't do 15 by 50 meters. We do the same amount of work, but now for a longer period of time, with attention to technique, motor neuron recruitment patterns, coordination, all of that stuff. Good posture, good mechanics, all of that. Week 8, we bring those run patterns out to 75 meters. But we're going to go hard. This is where it starts getting hard. There's a bit of deceleration that occurs after 60 meters for most athletes. And so athletes have to manage the deceleration effect as well. So they're starting to train a little bit of endurance. But when you're running as fast as possible, which most athletes will be running throughout the course of 75 meters, it's pretty hard on the nervous system. It's pretty hard to coordinate all of that. And so we keep those bouts, because we're going longer, we keep those bouts less frequent. So only 2 of those. And then finally, the 10th week of training, we're going to blast one hard 150 meter interval. Now, again, this is pretty crude, but I wanted to at least give you the visual of doing the same distance of work with the same intensity, but starting in week 1 with those little bites of steak. And then by week 10, now you've got the big chunk that you're ready to handle. Okay, so key takeaway number 2 is the practice of programming compatible training units within a session. And you guys understand this. This is the idea that you're going to, let's say in a distance running world, today is aerobic threshold day. These double threshold workouts are super popular these days. So that's a session where everything we do in that session is at the pace of aerobic threshold. Another example from the speed power world is on an Excel day, we're going to program similar training units that match the pedagogy that you might present to an athlete, or the cueing that you might present to an athlete in doing their Excel work. So Excel work is typically a little more bent over. It's an athlete coming out of the blocks. So there's a big horizontal component to Excel work. Excel work, and this is anything from 10 to 30 meters is generally the Excel phase of a sprint. Excel work, so it's horizontal. You're kind of bent over. You're pushing backwards a lot. You're landing behind the center of mass a lot, and you are staying on the ground for a longer period of time than you are when you're upright running, when you're running at max velocity. So there's a horizontal component to Excel work. There's a long power output, long ground contact times with Excel work. And so your other training units that you may program along with your Excels, let's say your plyometric unit that you may do after Excels, may be bounding or skipping for distance rather than for height. When you skip for distance, there's a horizontal component to that. When you skip for height, it's a vertical component. But if you're in the horizontal world teaching Excel type mechanics, you can repeat those mechanics and those cues with your jump unit by, again, sort of matching that programming. You can then go into the weight room and do work that focuses or emphasizes horizontal movement of the hips. So those are hinging movements, your deadlifts, your cleans. And then you can just basically shut up and let the training do the coaching because you're super coach and you've matched the themes with each of your training units. And so really good coaches understand that by having similar themes of all your training units allows for and provides for faster adaptation. So the brain and the body understand with every training unit what you're trying to get out of it. So then the brain says, okay, we're jumping, we're sprinting, we're moving horizontally. We're jumping, we're moving horizontally. We're weight training. We've got a horizontal component in our weight training. I get it now. I'm going to do that better the next time we have this session. Same with lactate threshold. We're working in a certain lactate or certain threshold in order to teach our athlete how to buffer hydrogen ions better. The body understands that with all those reps, there's no other sort of training modality thrown into the mix to create confusion. So the body says, okay, I get it now. Next time we do this kind of work, I'm going to do it more efficiently. And so super coaches, really good coaches, understand that programming compatible training units within a session will provide faster adaptation. This has really sound implications in the rehab world as well. So keep that in mind as we progress along. All right, compatible training units generally in the track and field world and a lot of performance training world. These are two big themes of training units. So in track and field terminology, we use the term for general training and we use the term neural training. What does this mean? Well, general work, so any unit that is general in nature, is a recovery-based activity. So you see I put there like an easy jog. That's general work. Neural work is the other side of the spectrum. These are activities that are coordinatively challenging. They're complex. They're usually ballistic, but they can also include heavy loads like your heavy static complex lift, like squats, deadlifts, bench press, these kinds of things. So these are two categories of training that generally do not mix. And so when we're programming training, we want to make sure all of the training units within our session are either general or neural, but not both. Okay, now I say that, and that's a huge generalization, and that sort of neat and tidy explanation works well for speed power athletes that do not accumulate metabolic waste in their sport. So these are your field eventers. Your short sprinters generally fall into that category. I would say baseball players, softball, volleyball, sports where there's quick bouts and then a good amount of recovery time. There's not a lot of metabolic waste. Where the waters get muddied with this general and neural categories are with your athletes that where their sport involves the accumulation of metabolic waste, lactate. Soccer players, distance runners, middle distance runners, long sprinters. What else? Basketball, a lot of the court and field sports, most of them. And so those athletes will have days, especially later in the season, where they are doing workouts that have a high neural demand, but also a high amount of metabolic waste. And so there may be a third box that I could have put in here that we call an extensive day or extensive session. And that's where, again, you have activities that have a high neural demand, fast sprinting, but they're also breathing hard. They're also kind of vomiting and looking for the trash can because it's really hard metabolically. And so understanding those categories and understanding the programming that goes into those categories is important, again, to get adaptation. And we'll explore those extensive days a little more throughout the course, because this is a course mostly for endurance athletes. But a neat and tidy definition in a speed power world is you do your general training on one day, you do your neural training on another day, and those two big blocks generally do not mix. Okay, here's examples of general work and neural work. So general work is your calisthenics, threshold running, recovery running, your simple dumbbell circuits, and then like a field event athlete, low intensity technical rehearsal. For a thrower, that might be just kind of like shadow drills in a ring using a PVC pipe. Examples of neural training, these are your complex activities, your multi-jointed lifting activities, Olympic lifts or heavy static lifts, again, squatting, deadlifting, bench pressing, your plyometric work, your sprinting work, stuff that requires a lot of temporal patterning, a lot of kinetic linking, a lot of coordinative challenges. And so a lot of good coaches will split these two categories up on different days in order to gain the intended adaptation. If the intended adaptation is recovery, then they stick with the general stuff. If the intended adaptation is a little more coordinative, then they stick with the neural stuff. They do not combine the two on the same day because it, again, causes confusion and the brain doesn't know, the body and the brain don't know what you want out of the day. And therefore it does not adapt as quickly. Again, going back to our microcycle and how this looks. So again, if you look at Monday, that is a neural day. Once we get through the warm-up, we're doing plyometrics, we're doing multi-jumps, and we're doing what looks like, I think it's cleans, it's hard to read, cleans and probably some incline and a deep squat. So that Monday is very much straight up neural day. Tuesday, again, the warm-up, static stretching, sprint drills, hurdle mobility, intensive tempo work, which is essentially lactate work, general strength circuit, which is a body weight circuit, medicine ball circuit, again, another sort of calisthenic circuit. So all those activities on Tuesday are general in nature. They're hard. Athletes are breathing hard, but they're not really taxing the neuromuscular system like day one did. And so they generally will be recovery. They will elicit a recovery response. Again, it's hard, but it's not neuromuscularly taxing. So the general and the neural categories and grouping training into general and neural categories are kind of the most well-known and widely used grouping strategies that coaches will use within a week or within their sessions. So general session one day, neural session the next day, and move on from there. Different athletes will have different densities of neural days than general days. But kind of that consideration of, is this a general day or a neural day, is very widely used in the training world. But there are some other groupings that you, as rehab specialists in particular, may employ for different reasons. So, kind of just going with a similar theme for all your training units. So, the first example of that may be that all of your bouncy work that you're doing in a rehab session, or for a healthy athlete in a training session, a sprinter, for example, all of that work may have similar amortization rates or similar coupling times. All that means is just simply the time that an athlete spends on the ground and rebounding off the ground. And different athletes, different sports have different amortization rates. A sprinter has very fast coupling times, very fast amortization rates. They land and change direction very quickly off the ground. A marathoner has slower coupling times and slower amortization rates, and that's just fine. And so as you're rehabbing someone and integrating some of this bouncy work back into their training, you may, in order, again, to send the same message with every activity, you may take into consideration the coupling times and the amortization rates for all of the activities that you're doing. That's just one sample. We've talked about the horizontal training components and kind of putting all of those on one day to teach an athlete good acceleration mechanics. Conversely, you can also do that by pairing up all of the vertical mechanics that go, all of them, the activities that might go along with upright running, skipping for height, snatches, squatting. Those are all very vertical plane oriented movements, and you might put all of those on one day in order to teach an athlete how to push up and down vertically. That typically happens on your max velocity days where you're upright running and training those patterns in an upright fashion. Energy system responses we talked about with the threshold training. Duration of power output is another thing that you might look at, especially as a rehab specialist. But how much time is the athlete spending putting force through the ground? Is it a long period of time like in an Excel, or is it a short period of time like in max velocity running? And all of your training components may have that similar duration of time putting force into the ground or into an implement or whatever. So those are some other potential grouping ideas that may come into play in the rehab setting. Another key theme, and one that is a good training practice, but again has rehab implications, is the management of density as the hard sessions progress. So as the season progresses and the hard sessions, the most intense sessions get harder, we need to make sure we're spreading out those sessions. So we're decreasing the density of hard work. So early in the season, remember, we have the small stake. It's small little bouts of intense work. Not too difficult, not too hard metabolically, not crazy difficult neurologically. So there's not a lot of neural fatigue that occurs. There is coordinative demand, but it's short-lived. The body bounces back quickly. So you can stack up a lot of those small pieces of steak in a week. As those bouts get longer and we start to have some metabolic demand as well, some buildup of lactate and those kinds of things, neurologically, those bouts become more challenging. They're more challenging coordinatively, more challenging metabolically. And so we need to spread out the density of those hard workouts appropriately. When we peak an athlete, this is definitely taken into consideration, especially a speed power athlete, where they don't like in swimming, they'll have this big taper and they'll drop a lot of volume. With a speed power athlete, they're never training too much volume, but what good speed power coaches do is they mitigate the density of the hard sessions that they do in the peaking phase. And so again, rehab implications, consider the stress that your rehab movements and rehab activities place on the brain and the neuromuscular system, and just make sure that there's proper recovery neurologically from a lot of those activities. Rehab should include neurological stress, not just physical stress. And so managing the density and understanding, are you doing something that's a pretty simple task that an athlete can recover from quickly, or do they need several days in between as the tasks get more complex and it becomes a harder training bout. Okay, moving along to a couple other broad stroke themes. So bring it back out from the minutia of training planning and session planning to some sort of bigger, broader perspectives. A lot of recent research has come out proving and showing that heavy strength training and plyometric work, a combination of those two training units, will improve running economy with endurance athletes. And so if your endurance athletes aren't doing some form of heavy weight training, aren't doing some form of plyometrics, they're missing the boat on improving their economy. And this obviously has rehab implications as well, as you try to get your athletes and runners and other athletes to move better. Heavy weight training, bouncy stuff improves economy. But I'll tell you a little story about when I took this job at Under Armour. I had about 2 months between when my job ended at Wyoming and when I had to be out in Baltimore to report for work. So I took those 2 months and traveled around and talked to a lot of different strength coaches. Track and field coaches who program strength training, strength coaches for other sports, physical therapists for other sports that program strength training. And I asked them, with these endurance type athletes, these middle and long distance runners, what's the one activity that you would employ in the weight room? And I thought they would say cleans, power cleans. I thought maybe the deadlift, maybe some plyometric activities. None of them said that. All of them, they don't even know each other. All of them said that a healthy dose of body weight work is what they would employ with distance runners. So it kind of goes against what the research shows, but I think it's just simply the importance of calisthenics and the effectiveness of calisthenics just isn't researched because there's so much variety in how to employ this stuff. And yes, I'm talking the 1980s leotard aerobics type work, the Kipchoge step aerobics, the Sebco circuits that he used to do, Tabata type work. All of that stuff is all a little bit different, but it all has a little bit of bouncy work to it, big ranges of motion, variety of movement. And so you'll see I put in this slide that those all three combined, those activities, the bouncy stuff, the heavy lifting, and the body weight movement, all build the skills, the basic skills of an athlete's ability to negotiate the ground and bounce off the ground and to manage their own body weight. And that's ultimately what we're trying to do as coaches and as rehab specialists. Build an athlete's resiliency, an ability to manage load and body weight and the ground. And so here are the articles. This is very recent research. 2 of these are from last year. They simply show that heavy resistance training and plyometric training combined have the best result for improving running economy. But I will add that while it's not heavily researched, there's a ton of anecdotal evidence on the effectiveness of employing a healthy dose of calisthenic work or circuit training into an athlete's training regimen. And this is for all athletes of all levels, from your 10-year-old youth athlete to your 90-year-old masters athletes to your pro NBA athletes. A healthy dose of properly programmed calisthenic work goes a long way towards keeping athletes healthy and keeping them skilled at, again, negotiating the ground and managing their own body weight. This book was loaned to me by one of my mentors, Dan Paff, who's well-known in track and field coaching circles. but it is a book that was written by a German physical education teacher. And it goes into great detail on how to program circuits for different purposes. And he starts with programming circuits for 10-year-old physical education students. And what are we trying to get out of them? And he again, in great detail, employs a lot of variety, employs a tempo to movement quality, holds students to task on number of reps that they achieve in a certain amount of time, and records those, and again goes into detail into how to present that to 10-year-olds. And it's very effective. And that's where I think we've gone wrong when we employ and prescribe body weight work. We do not coach tempo of movement. We do not coach range of motion. We don't coach some very simple postural skills and movement mechanics with each rep. It's sort of like stuff we do at the end. Maybe it's a core circuit where athletes are lying on the ground for every activity. Not very specific and not very helpful for negotiating the ground. Or they're planking, or they're doing mini band work. Not a lot of movement quality is being employed with any of those activities. The activities that, again, are old school calisthenic type stuff, your air squats, your jumping jacks, your lunges, your step-ups, push-ups, pull-ups, all of those types of activities which are complex, big ranges of motion and can be coached and employed in different fashions, those are the ones that move the needle on movement quality. So, wrapping up, our last theme that we'll talk about during the course, I want to introduce here, is the practice that a lot of good performance coaches use and understand, and that is employing certain protocols of training to elicit recovery responses in the form of hormonal release. So again, where this has rehab implications is rehab specialists are also trying to elicit recovery responses. They're trying to accelerate recovery. Good performance coaches understand how to manipulate protocols, training protocols, sets and rep schemes, work rest interval schemes to get certain anabolic hormone release. Naturally, this is all drug-free training. So you can do this in the weight room with heavy loads to get a testosterone release. You can do this with a little bit lighter loads, a little more volume to get a growth hormone release in the weight room under load. And that's great. But in a rehab setting, you might not have athletes that can handle load. They might be at various stages of rehab where they can't put any external load on. So there's also a lot of circuit training, again, going back to my circuit training soapbox, there's a lot of protocols in the circuit training units and circuit training world that can also elicit hormonal and endocrine responses. And those mostly come in the form of manipulating work and rest intervals to accumulate a mild to moderate level of lactate. And it's that mild to moderate level of lactate accumulation that stimulates recovery responses in the form of anabolic hormone release, specifically growth hormone. So rehab specialists can utilize these with their athletes that cannot handle external load, but they can handle body weight work, and you can get them breathing just hard enough with your work and rest intervals to accumulate a little bit of lactate, and that will accelerate the body's natural recovery responses. So super useful for rehab implications. So to review, we first talked about language that I will use, maybe pick out that one slide and bookmark that slide, the macro cycle, the mesocycle, microcycles, etc. Then some key themes. So one, employing speed and power training early and often, breaking it up into smaller digestible bouts early in a season and then extending from there so that you can always keep the intensity high. Compatible training units within a session, your general training, your neural training, the idea of being mindful of density of hard work and how that is used in peaking phases, the importance and the balance of employing loaded work, bouncy work, and our fun calisthenic aerobic type work. And finally, employing our calisthenic work in certain protocols to elicit endocrine responses and utilizing that in the rehab setting. So we'll discuss all of those more in depth. Please feel free to reach out to me in the meantime if you have some questions or need some clarification. If it's something that we'll go over, in depth in class, I'll just respond and email that to you. But otherwise, please feel free to reach out. Thanks. Have a great week, and we'll see you next weekend.